I am going to be as brief with this video as I can be. I want you to understand how much making this video is going to wound me as a person. I have been a Star Trek fan literally for my entire life. Star Trek The Next Generation began to air the very same year that I was born. And while it wasn't a couple of years later until my family started watching it, I did watch it regularly since about the time that I was 2 years old until it ended 5 years later. My mother is a Star Trek fan who grew up watching the original show. Her mother was a Star Trek mega fan who was one of the first people who I ever knew who collected the original series movies. I can still remember what it was like sitting there and watching the pilot episode of Star Trek Voyager, so excited to see another traditional Star Trek series with a ship exploring space. I never really watched Star Trek Deep Space Nine when it was on the air, but years later I went back to it and it became my favorite series in the franchise. I love this world because of what it stands for, that no matter how bad things get, there's still a chance of building a brighter future for everyone. When Star Trek Enterprise rolled around and was a relative disappointment, I stuck with it for far longer than I should have. I, like many fans, came back for its 4th season, but I knew at the time that that wasn't going to be enough, and Star Trek disappeared from television. Ever since then, I have been waiting for the day when we would get more televised Star Trek. As much as I don't mind the recent run of movies, Star Trek just works better as a TV show. So when Star Trek Discovery was announced and it started to come out how diverse this crew was going to be, that the setting was going to be the famed Klingon Federation War, I could not have been more excited. Which is why it pains me to say that I don't like this show. I think it's alright. It has its moments where things feel like Star Trek, but for the most part, this is not a Star Trek show. Even ignoring the visual differences, the odd, too technologically looking ship designs and prop designs, and the too dark bridge, the complete visual reboot of the Klingon species. Even overlooking all of those things, this isn't a Star Trek series. The characters in this act nothing like Starfleet officers. They're all rude to each other, like they have some kind of chip on their shoulder. Even the main character, who should be our insert into this world, who should most encapsulate what this world is, so that we can live vicariously through her, is unlike any Starfleet officer we've ever seen. She barely has any of that optimism that people of the time are known for. The characters are just bad as Star Trek characters, but they're not terrible overall. They're decent enough characters as far as characters go. The special effects are good, though they do invoke the J.J. Abrams era Star Trek movies rather than anything that we ever saw in the TV show. These don't feel like designs and effects from the original series era made more modern so that they look good. This feels like something completely different, just like the JJ movie did. And the stories, while bad as Star Trek stories, aren't the worst things I've ever seen. Star Trek Discovery up to this point feels nothing like a Star Trek show, but it does feel like any other generic science fiction series that gets put on TV periodically only to be taken down because nobody watches it. I genuinely think that people would be much, much harder on this show if it didn't have the Star Trek name carrying it along. But that isn't to say that I hate it. I don't hate it. What wounds me about it so much is that it claims to be Star Trek when it so obviously isn't. I've only seen the first 3 episodes so far, and Episode 3, I think, did do a slightly better job, but I will get into my problems with the transition from the first 2 episodes to the 3rd one in just a little while, so bear with me. I especially liked the character of Sylvia Tilly, Cadet Sylvia Tilly. I really liked her character. She stood out as kind of a bright spot in that episode. She was a lot of fun, and I really liked the alien character, Saru, who seems like he's going to be a prominent recurring character. But there's literally no one else in the main cast of this show that I like at all. I can't imagine myself sitting down and getting to know these people. I can't imagine them ever becoming like a family, like the crews of the other series were known to do by the end. Every set is dark, every shot is tight in on something and turned on its side. It makes everything feel small and claustrophobic. There's none of the grand sense of optimism that even the darkest stories in Star Trek's past have still managed to hang on to in one way or another. It's as if the writers on this show were incapable of writing dark stories unless the lighting is literally dark and there is no silver lining. Because it's serialized, everything is drawn out over multiple episodes and hardly anything is concluded by the end of each individual episode, breaking from Star Trek tradition, but that isn't the worst thing in the world. And while I can understand wanting to completely redo the visuals for your Star Trek show, the drastic change in visuals, not just from the original series era where this is set, but from all Star Trek television shows, doesn't do anything to help it feel more like a Star Trek television show. Starfleet ships now have hardly anything memorable or unique about them, and the Klingon ships that they've used so far are some of the most generic things I've ever seen. They could just as easily be an Asgard ship from Stargate. The only one with a design that I actually liked was like this big curved flying wing, but it looked more like a Romulan design than a Klingon one. The visual continuity of Star Trek is important. It lends realism to this world that is designed to give us hope for the future. Good visual continuity in this universe helps us to suspend our disbelief and believe that this world could happen. That's why it's important. Not just because it doesn't look the same. It's important because it actually means something. That's why every single series since The Next Generation has shared mostly consistent visuals. And it's why I have a really hard time getting past the fact that this series is so flagrant in not doing so. The first 2 episodes of the show were an extended pilot, but unlike most pilots and unlike all past Star Trek pilots, they didn't set up the cast of characters that we're going to be following for the rest of the series, introduce us to the starship, and give us a sense of what the episodes from that point on were going to feel like. Though I guess it kinda did the last one a little bit. These 2 episodes are set on a completely different ship with a completely different crew, save for Mr. Saru and the main character, Michael Burnham. And while we did get to see the start of this Klingon conflict that is supposedly going to be the backbone of the show, hardly anything else from these 2 episodes carries over. They could have started with episode 3, given us Michael's involvement in the start of the Klingon conflict through dialogue, and I think things would have overall been a lot better. For one specific reason, and that is Michelle Yeoh's character. And don't get me wrong, Michelle Yeoh, who played Michael Burnham's original captain on the USS Senjo, I believe is how it's pronounced. Her name was Captain Giorgio, if I remember correctly, but I could be mistaken. Don't get me wrong, she was the best thing about this show. She was the only character in this show who felt like a Star Trek character. And, spoiler warning, she was killed off unceremoniously in the 2nd episode. Now, rather than getting to follow her and her crew for the next however many years this show lasts, we get to follow generic white douchebag captain. And don't get me wrong, I'm not up in arms because they replaced an Asian actress with a Caucasian actor, though I think that the accusation could be made that they did whitewash the role. That's not my problem. My problem is that the character who replaced her is one of the most thoroughly unlikable characters I have ever seen in Star Trek canon. I think the Talk from Superheroes podcast said it better than I ever could. I was raised on Star Trek. The original series was always on in my house. I loved TNG and DS9 and Voyager. I even watched all of Enterprise, and I have a lot of problems with Star Trek Discovery. Mainly, the world is garbage right now. The real world that we live in. I mean, people are having their rights taken away, minorities are being oppressed. We may enter nuclear war, and I'm sad every day. And when I heard there was a new Star Trek, I thought, oh my god, a hopeful, moral, beautiful show that will be an hour of light in my life every week. Thank you. And then I turn it on, and it's just secrets and darkness and lies and anger, and no room is ever fully lit. There's no hope or optimism in this show, and that's not what I want. But I also don't think it's what the world needs right now. There isn't an ounce of optimism or compassion or hope in the show except for Michelle Yeoh's character. She felt like she was Star Trek, and she's dead. She felt like a fully fleshed out, classic Star Trek show captain and leader, and exactly what I was looking for. Then they killed her in episode 2, and all hope left the show with her, and I've despised the show ever since. Just reading that hurts me because it dredges up exactly how I feel. It's like she read my mind. As of right now, Star Trek Discovery is not Star Trek. It's just some generic Star Trek-like science fiction show. Don't get me wrong, it usually takes a Star Trek show a year or 2 to really find itself and get better, and it could improve. But then there are things like what they've done to the Klingons that make me feel like that even if it does, it will never be Star Trek. The Klingons, I would argue, are the best known and best liked fictional alien race in science fiction history. You have people who live their lives based on a modified version of the Klingon code because it advocates strength and honor. You have people who go dressed as them to conventions, who learn the language. Star Trek fans adore the Klingons. This series promised us the Klingon Federation War in a way that we never imagined we'd ever get it, from the perspective of both the Federation and a fully fleshed out cast of sympathetic Klingon characters, and that's just not what we're getting. Again, I'm actually going to go to someone else's words because I feel that someone else has already said this better than I ever could. But briefly first, for those who don't know, the Klingons were almost completely redesigned for this series. They still have the ridges on their heads, but otherwise they're almost a completely different animal, like some kind of amphibian thing with extra nostrils. And they have so much makeup on their faces that even when they're speaking English, which they don't do often because they do speak Klingon when they're alone together, it's almost impossible to understand what they're saying. They sound like they're mumbling with their mouths full of pudding. It creates this immediate separation between the audience and the character. They can't emote through their makeup, they can't speak through their prosthetic, and so it is that much more difficult for the audience to relate to them as people. Not only that, but this is the darkest that the Klingons have ever looked. They were always meant to have some African-esque skin tone. But now, with the exception of an albino character, their skin is almost completely velvet black. At the recent New York Comic-Con, a fan asked a panel of Discovery crew about this exact thing. Klingon armor, Klingon architecture is all now very tribal looking. Combine that with the fact that they have the darkest skin tone of any Klingons in the franchise, and these new Klingons feel more African than they ever have before. What this fan said specifically is that they look so African and yet they're the bad guys, and it feels alienating. Something which I completely agree with. It was executive producer Alex Kurtzman who replied, and not only did he skirt the question completely, but this was his response. At the heart of Star Trek is the idea that what we think of others is a mirror to ourselves, going on to make the argument that they have plans to represent the Klingons fairly. We represented both sides of the war in a way that is understandable and relatable. We need to know what it was like for them to go through it too. We wanted to shift everyone's perspective of what the Klingons are, because they've often been relegated to just the bad guy. He added that Discovery will show a lot of Klingons who are all created around the central premise of what Klingons are, whatever that ends up meaning in this show. But that the overall goal of the Klingons in the series is to, for lack of a better word, humanize them. He closed out his response by saying that if they didn't explore those angles, it wouldn't be Star Trek. Gizmodo.com correspondent Catherine Trendacosta responded to his response. The problem that Discovery faces is that A, it's a prequel. So all this stuff that they're adding to the Klingons has to be explained in the context of the work the other shows will do. And while the original series does have much suaver but much flatter versions of the Klingons, the look of these Klingons is othering. It does play into stereotypes of savages that specifically plays as a contrast to white and Western aesthetics. Even though the show takes place before the original series, it's airing after, and it feels like we've gone backwards with the Klingons. She pointed out a fallacy in Kurtzman's argument. The Klingons have been developed a lot more over the course of the 50 years they've existed. By the end of Deep Space Nine, they become allies with a culture that fans knew a lot about. Worf and B'Elanna Torres on Voyager both did a lot of work as characters to illuminate different things about that culture. Going back now and claiming that they have to flesh out the Klingon culture in order to make them relatable is absolutely ridiculous, especially if this is the way they're going about it. The Klingons of the Next Generation and Deep Space Nine and Voyager, you could understand what they were saying. You could see what expressions their faces were making. Immediately, they're already much more relatable than these Klingons seem like they will ever be able to be. And like I said before, I've only watched the first 3 episodes so far. I haven't seen episode 4 yet. But from what I understand, we find out in episode 4 that this new sect of Klingons eats their enemies like some kind of animals, suggesting that they could be cannibals, which is one of the most savage things I've ever heard about in a Star Trek show. I mean, obviously I'm still going to give the episode a watch and give it a chance, but holy shit, if that ends up being true, that might be it for me. I might not be able to watch the show anymore. Something like that happens and immediately the slightly racist undertones that I've been implying through this entire rant become overtones and I'm out. I can't believe that this is what is representing Star Trek now. Again, I want to reiterate, as a TV show I don't think it's terrible, but, and I will argue this to my last breath, I do think it is a terrible Star Trek show. I do hope that it finds its footing. I do hope that it manages to redeem itself in my eyes and the eyes of many other fans who feel the same way. But assuming that it can't, I hope that it gets canceled. I really genuinely do, because maybe if it does, in another 12 years, we'll see a new Star Trek series that manages to do things right. And already, this video is much longer than I ever intended it to be, so I'm going to go ahead and call it now. Guys, this has been my 2 cents on this topic. If you guys have seen Star Trek Discovery, let me know what you think of it. I know my opinions here have been really harsh, but I promise I will be open to all of yours. As per usual, let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below. Either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.